Within each and every one of us is this inner critic. It's like a creeping worm that works its way in our brains. It starts when we're little. Well-intentioned people say things that have a little negative twist and we sort of take them in. Or people aren't so well-intentioned and they say things that are just downright rotten. Like my father used to tell me, look, you couldn't hit the broadside of a barn with a shotgun. You couldn't drive a nail into soft wood. They would say these self-deprecating things, right? And then pretty soon I got the idea that I wasn't worth much. Once I got that idea, it formed this tape and this message started to circulate and work its way throughout my brain. I became my own inner critic. And every time I had an opportunity to do something positive, I would sabotage it. I didn't think it would apply to me. I became hopeless. I became overwhelmed. So today we're going to take a look at how to beat the inner critic in all of us. Stay tuned. You know if you have an inner critic when you start to hear these whispering thoughts kind of echoing through your brain. Thoughts like, God, I'm useless. No wonder I'm not the center of attention at parties because I'm dull and boring. Oh my goodness. Why didn't she pick me to do the presentation? I'm awful. I'm a fraud. I'm fat. I'm lazy. I wish I was like him. I wish I was like her. She's a selfish, horrible, nasty person. But he likes her more than me. Nobody likes me. I'm not nice. I'll never have somebody to love me. Let's face it, I'm too unattractive to ever have a happy life. I'm too messed up. I'm too crazy. I'm too deranged. I'm too dull. I'm not smart enough. I can't do it. Those thoughts of some sort of helplessness invade our cranium and get us all caught up. And then when we have opportunities, we freeze. We just don't think we can do it. So what do we do when these thoughts start to develop? These thoughts that are attached to the way we think. It's almost like they form a filter. So one day we were positive and could see ourselves in a positive light. And then all of a sudden, the inner critic was developed. And now we criticize ourselves. And what's weird is one side of this inner critic is a defensive mechanism kind of designed to protect us. So when we have a chance to go ask that beautiful woman for a date, the inner critic says, wait, whoa, 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 let me protect you here. You're too stupid. You're too ugly. You don't have a chance. Don't do it. The inner critic often intervenes in a seemingly protective way, but it does so by attacking our self-worth. So if you've ever struggled with your self-worth, if you've ever struggled with your identity, well, there's good news. You can change it. You can reclaim those thoughts. The first step in reclaiming those thoughts is to remember that this inner critic really is tied into the way in which we view the world, right? We have a monologue that inside of our brain where we speak to ourselves about 45,000 words a day. So if we lean to that negative side or that inner critic is strong, that's a lot of words with a lot of negative messages, right? And so part of the antidote to dealing with this inner criticism, right, this inner critic, is that first we have to identify it, and then we have to figure out how to nullify it, and then how to get it out of there. So the first thing we have to do is become very self-aware, right? You have to become aware as to who you really are. So who are you, right? What's the good about you? What type of things do you enjoy? The more you can become aware about you, the more it will help you. So let's take an honest survey, right? Do you think you're smart? Do you think you're not smart? Do you think you're handsome? Do you think you're not handsome? Do you think you're beautiful? Do you not think you're beautiful? Write those things down and then sort of look at them and say, look, do you think those are true? And then just kind of set it to the side. Now, every time a negative thought gets created in your brain from this self-critical thinking, right? You have to sort of bounce off of it and say, okay, there's the thought. Now, what do I think of this thought? And then you have to kind of set it to the side and keep moving. You have to break the thought by distracting yourself. You have to examine the evidence. Is it really true? And you have to work on positivity. So let's say you're really stuck in this inner critic. What you have to do at a bare minimum is to write 25 statements. Positive statements that stress your goodness. I'm amazing. I'm handsome. I'm smart. I rock this world. You have to come up with at least 25, but it wouldn't hurt to come up with 50 or maybe even 100. These statements that stress your goodness. And if you struggle with understanding what your goodness is, then ask, what things would my grandmother say? What things would my father say? If those were positive people in your life. Or maybe it was a teacher. What would my teacher say? Or maybe it was a coach. What would my coach say? Maybe it was someone from the church you attended or the club you're a part of. What would they say about my goodness? So gather those thoughts and write them out. And then I tell people, put those thoughts by the mirror in the bathroom. So every day when you get up to go wash your face, look at those thoughts and remind yourself of your goodness. Because what you're trying to do is feed your inner critic truth. And by feeding the inner critic truth, you hope to kind of change the way that inner critic looks. So stress your goodness. Then when you do have a thought and it tends to go critical, try to stop it, write down the thought, and then ask yourself, is this thought true? Dissect it, look at it. What part of the thought is true? What part of that thought really isn't true? The part that's not true, you're going to try to reframe, or you're going to turn it into something that is true, and then you're going to write it out, and then you're going to stress that part, right? So if you can stress your worth, it makes a big difference. Now, sometimes that inner critic was started when we're young, and so it's really in there, and sometimes we can identify it. Like I know, right, when I think back to my childhood, I can remember thinking that I wouldn't amount to much. And so even now, right, at the age of 55, there's times where I start to do something and I think I can't do it. In that moment, I have to stop, back up and say, look, Pat, you're no longer 6. You can do it. Yes, it might be difficult. You might it might be tough to do, but you can do it. Don't stop just because you're criticizing yourself. So you have to push through. So what triggers your inner critic? Is it when there's a new situation? Is it when you face something that you have failed in before? Is it when it's related to something that your father or your mother or some friend or a teacher said and it gets spinning in your brain and kicks you in a direction that's negative? Years ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who was an executive. And every time he got a job promotion, right, he would get really confident and get another job promotion, and then always he would reach this ceiling. And when he got to this point where he was just about to take this amazing leap of responsibility, he would end up sabotaging himself and he would get demoted, he would leave the company, something would happen. And so he was thinking about it, and one day we were talking about this inner critic, and he had this epiphany. And he said, oh my goodness, I remember. And I said, what do you remember? He said, when I was about 10, somewhere 10 to 12, I had a paper route. And I would go and I would collect the money from the paper route and I would save it. And so I would save and save and save. And we were kind of a poor family. And so when Christmas came, we would divide up the family, uncles, aunts, everybody. And everybody would put their name in a hat and everybody would take one name and you would buy a gift for that one person. And there'd be a cap on the present. Well, this one particular year, I had done so well in my paper route that I decided to buy everybody a present. And so I was so excited because I scrimped and I saved and I wrapped. And on Christmas morning, I laid out all the gifts and I was so excited until my uncle looked at what I had done and said, "You are the most selfish person I know." Here everybody is trying to follow the rules and you think you're some goody two-shoe. And he stormed off. And he said, from that moment, I never wanted to be seen as successful. So the inner critic crept into my brain. And every time I tried to become successful, I sabotaged myself. What is the inner critic in your brain? What is it that you are using inadvertently sometimes to sabotage your future? You can identify it, right? And if you can identify it, you can work on it and you can set yourself free. Because believe it or not, you're an amazing individual with amazing potential and an amazing future. You just have to learn to identify that inner critic and then move away from him. And you can do it. There's proof. So whose voice do you hear when you hear that inner critic? My friend, he heard his uncle. I hear my father. Whose voice do you hear? Because once you can identify that voice, you can also distance yourself from that voice. So when you have an inner critic speaking to you and you're locked in there and you can't seem to shake it no matter what, here's a couple things you can do. So first, identify what it is that you're trying to do. So I'm trying to get a job, I'm trying to do a speech, I'm trying to ask this girl out. Okay, this is what I'm going to try to do. And then ask the inner critic, what do you want me to do? And the inner critic, I'm sure, will say, run, right? And then ask the inner critic, why do you want me to do that? What are you afraid of if I don't listen to you, Mr. Inner Critic? And then ask yourself, hey, inner critic, what would make this easier on you? And then ask yourself, do you want to listen to that inner critic, or do you want to stretch out and do a little risk and see what life is really like? Guess what? You can overcome that inner critic. I believe in you, and you know what? I really believe you have the potential, because as long as there's hope, right, we can change the world. So look, if you think this video has helped you, please like it. If you think it might help someone else, share it. If you have comments about your inner critic, what works, what doesn't work, where you got stuck, please write them in the comments. And you know what? If you haven't subscribed, please do so, because we know that together we can change the world. Doc out.